Thank you, Gabriel and Dustin and Pioneer Works in general. I have been to a great number of events at Pioneer Works. I think this is the first one I've actually ever participated in as anything other than a spectator or listener. So thank you for this, and thank you also for this exhibition of Anthony's work that we literally could not see in another space. I mean, so it is as though Pioneer Works were custom built for Anthony's sculptures, which it wasn't, but it seems as though it was. And I do want to reiterate that, as I've been told, after we finish this panel, whenever we finish this panel, which will probably be around 9:15 or 9:20, then the exhibition will be open for another half hour if people want to. If people didn't get a chance to see it, or if people want to see it again after check out some of the sculptures in relationship to the discussion that we've had. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel of discussants, and then they will speak in the order in which I have introduced them, but without further introductions. But the first person that we will hear from, and who does deserve a special introduction, of course, is Anthony McCall, who is the artist who has made this exhibition, but who really created a new genre or form of, well, art making, or is it film making, which is the solid light film, which is what these works are, in a sense, descendant from. Anthony has done a lot of work over his career, and has had these series of exhibitions all over the world now, including one that is up in London, or at Hayward Gallery, is that right?
The Hepworth.
At the Hepworth Museum in Yorkshire, which has received also incredible reviews over there. After Anthony will be Melissa Ragona, who's Associate Professor of Visual Culture and Critical Theory at Carnegie Mellon. I should say, though, I want to actually state about the panel itself, is that we have, in addition to Anthony, we have three extremely knowledgeable people about not just cinema and not just art, but really about the intersection between art and cinema. So I'm just going to give their sort of professional affiliations rather than longer bios and CVs, but all three of them have been instrumental in thinking about the contemporary work and intersections of art and cinema, art and film, but also the historical antecedents of that in Anthony's work, but also in the work of people like Bruce Conner and Stan Brakhage and Carolee, Schneemann, and others. So the person after Anthony to speak will be Melissa Ragona, as I said, Associate Professor of Visual Culture and Critical Theory at Carnegie Mellon. After her will be Johanna Gosse, who is Visiting Assistant Professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder, and before that we had the great pleasure of having her as a Mellon Fellow for a couple of years in my department at Columbia. And afterward will be Ed Halter, known to many of you here if you are cinema and art buffs, as the founding director, one of the founding directors of the Brooklyn space, a different part of Brooklyn space, light industry, where many discussions, presentations, performances, lectures about precisely the intersection of art and cinema, or I think light industry. I've heard it a million times, but I can't remember. Film and electronic arts, or something, is how it is normally cast. So after each of them says a few words, then we will have a discussion amongst ourselves a bit, and then it will be opened up to the audience for questions. We do ask that if you have a question that you wait for, there'll be a microphone that will come so that everyone will be able to hear. So without further ado, we will start. So Melissa will go. Oh, no, sorry, Anthony. Sorry.
You know, maybe it's better that way.
No.
Okay. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. I thought that I would just make some nuts and bolts remarks about the installation here as a way to start the ball rolling. Essentially, in this installation, we have 6 individual solid light works that were all made separately, independent of any particular space in mind, but with certain space requirements. Essentially, I selected these 6 out of a possible 25 to be part of an installation here. But my point is that it's not a site-specific exhibition at all. However, my work is very site-sensitive, and so way beyond just there being certain requirements like a 30-foot ceiling or some such, I've been very interested in how the work might work in the space, and I spend a lot of time thinking about a space before actually committing to it. One of the things that's important about doing an installation like this is that this space, even though it's not tailored for the work, has to become very much geared to it, and so I use the term site-sensitive. There's not an inch of this space that we haven't thought about, and so, for instance, it's an altered space. The Pioneer Works have this magnificent building with this high ceiling, but in fact we did quite a lot of altering. We put in some walls, to create a light lock corridor. We blacked out all the windows, which was no small feat, and very importantly we carpeted the space. That has certain functions. One is to improve the acoustics enormously. It dampens the acoustics down, less reverberation, which means that when people talk to one another in the spaces, as they do, their voices are sort of absorbed into the walls. And it's also a kind of nod back to cinema, in that movie theatres were always carpeted, probably for the same reasons, in fact, acoustic reasons. One of the things about the solid light works is that they are very much geared to a human scale, and the way I calculate that is, I don't know if you remember that famous drawing Da Vinci did of the Vitruvian Man, with a man with his arms and legs outstretched in a circle. Well, that Vitruvian Man moment is exactly halfway down one of my cones of light. And so any of these forms is both much smaller and much larger than a human, but in fact it doesn't scale up infinitely. I mean, if I made the height of these works much taller, they simply would stop working. Yes, I had 2 periods of making solid light works. One was in the 70s and the other began around 2000. And in the second period of work, I've tended to title the works in particularly evocative ways. They have titles that refer to the corporeal. So you've got Between You and I, Meeting You Halfway, Breath, You and I Horizontal, and so on. And these were just a hint of what I had in mind when I was making them. These titles also, of course, refer to the relationship between the spectator and the work. I've said many times that these works exist in a kind of space between an overlapping space between cinema, sculpture, and drawing. And it's a very simple idea, but I think it's worth, just to get this ball rolling, to just say briefly why, what I see in each of those terms. So cinema really simply means that the works are very structured in time. They have a shape to them, which has an outline and can be followed and is completed and so on. I tend to go for a cyclical structure, which is a continuous way of keeping something going continuously. This business of time, I think, is very important. Many people say that they're moved by the moving plane, the planes of light, by this sculptural object. And light is usually given the credit for this. And I do work with light, but I think if you imagine in that room, instead of video projectors, we had slide projectors projecting simply a slide of the form, it would look superficially exactly the same. But I think after a few moments, you would use it up and pass on to something else. And I think it's the motion, structured motion, which actually creates the emotion that produces the reaction that the works receive from their visitors. So sculpture, well, we have a conflict immediately between sculpture and cinema, because with cinema you imagine fast movement. And what I found with these works is if the motion is fast, then people immediately stay rooted to the spot and start watching. Whereas if you're going to look at sculpture, you're going to explore sculpture, you have to use your own body, you have to move around it. And that movement will be thwarted by fast motion. So I found, in fact, that the kind of motion that works so that these works retain their sculptural quality is to make virtue a virtue of slowness. And so, in fact, at first sight, the works are not moving at all. Finally, drawing, and this is nearly my final point. These are animated line drawings, and I think I mentioned earlier that perhaps I didn't, but that the works are structured around the idea of reciprocity and exchange, and with this kind of drawing, I was able to develop a way to have a masking process whereby I could have two forms in play at once. So, for instance, in the first piece in here called Meeting You Halfway, there are two identical ellipses, but each of them is moving at a different, is expanding and contracting at a different speed, and they are separated from one another and brought together by a device called the wipe, which is an invisible edge that goes back and forth within the frame, deciding what proportion you'll see of each. And I think probably I'm going to leave it there, because I think probably I'm out of time anyway, and it seems like a good spot to stop. Thank you.
Test. Great. Thanks, Anthony and Branden. That was so nice to hear you talk. I can't wait to hear more, and I have many, many questions for you. I wrote a little bit of a piece because we had to keep it short and timed, and that's when I do best, is if I read. Otherwise, I'll go way over. So I'm going to turn on this little mechanism. Oh, good. That's my first slide. Awesome. And if I falter, I think we have an incredible tech crew back there. So I'm going to focus on Anthony's work and just for a second, and then I have more intricate questions later, and the notion of sound. Anthony's relationship to sound is a complicated one. So in this brief gloss, I want to point back to a few of Anthony's earlier works, which are key to understanding the kinds of relationships he is forging with composers and musicians, and this general issue of sound in his work, and especially the most recent set of artists who performed with his solid light works, several of whom are here tonight, including David Grubbs, MV Carbon, Spencer Ye, and I think a few more are here. Incredible series, and David curated that, I think, along with Anthony. But Anthony might see everything I'm going to say tonight differently. And what I always say this when I'm with Carolee on stage 2, the artist is present, which is always really challenging. So this is all posed in the form of a question to Anthony. I'm thinking that there is an early, interrelated unresolved schism in your approaches to sound. One is bound up in a tension between your earlier approaches to photography, performance, and film, steeped as they were in an integrated system of post-minimalist phenomenology and conceptual art, and your fervor for and dedication to examining a politics of mediated culture. Though most point to your film with journalist Andrew Tyndall called Argument, boom, works, in which, yeah, it's a great image, great film, an interrogation of, and this is a quote from their 16 working statements, the photographic image, written text in the screen, and the words on the soundtrack as an important turning point that moves you beyond your intense focus on light, duration, space, projection, and the epistemology of film as a sculptural and phenomenological object. But I want to argue, as I believe Branden Joseph has in his wonderful essay, Sparring with the Spectacle, that your interest in complex social and political mediations began much earlier, especially present in your unrealized collaborative project with Carolee Schneemann, who's here tonight, called Time Sharing in 1971. They're so beautiful. Time sharing is a precursor in a very important way to Schneemann's ABC We Print Anything in the Cards, on view currently in her stellar MoMA PS1 exhibition. And I just wanted to say it's so beautiful that the two exhibitions are parallel, Anthony's and Carolee's, because they've shared many, 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 many years together in on many different levels, as we know. Anyhow, so it also sets the stage for some of your works to come, Anthony, such as Circulation Figures, White Bag, White Noise, Landscape for Fire, and, as I mentioned above, the most blatantly theorized film essay that is also a book about sound and image called Argument. Where am I? Let me catch it. Got it. In Time Sharing, go back to that, you and Schneemann proposed the use of tape recording film in the production of a daily journal in which a self-imposed surveillance of your relationship, both public and private, would be enacted. As I've argued for Schneemann's ABC project, private moments such as washing the dishes, cooking a meal, having sex, or becoming embroiled in an argument, once recorded, become abstract and universal. Or, as you recognized in Time Sharing, and this is a quote from Anthony, under the eye of media, everything becomes performance. Later in your work with Tyndall and Argument, such observations are heightened to the point of an acute, unforgiving Marxist Kumbarthian theory. At one point on screen in Argument, we see the printed caption. The spoken word has authenticity. It's closer to what is heard. But simultaneously, a voiceover confounds our reading of the image words we see here in front of us. So I want you to try to read that as I'm reading this, which happens in the film. And this audio voice is the printed caption has authority. It always has the last word. And later on, an even more extreme statement is projected. The three filmic modes of image, soundtrack, and caption work together to create a homogeneous meaning. But auditioned over this, we hear, the three filmic modes of image, soundtrack, and caption work in tension with one another to produce heterogeneous meaning. I have to have a little drink. I'm almost done. So rewinding back to Circulation Figures, produced 6 years before Argument, you theorize the rotating panopticon of mediated culture. You instruct your 15 participants, Carolee Schneemann included, to record their own presence. You explain the subjects of the event and your camera are the other photographers and filmmakers. Reflexivity abounds. The soundtrack is both the sound of the rustling newspapers, another reference to saturated media culture, through which the participants walk as they film and photograph each other, as well as the click and burr of the Bolex, the Polaroid, the Beaulieu, the duoflex, I can never say that, and other now analog fetishes inside the obsessive world of moving and still camera collectors. The large mirrors propped up on either side of the mounds of newspaper are repeated again inside the single lens reflex cameras. And you reverse the conventional terms of sound-image relations. In 2011, you are able to fully realize your intentions. You invert how most viewers think about locational sound. Movement is silent, stasis is loud, noisy, restless. Clip from the film, Circulation Figures. Likewise, audience members participating in the immersive environments of your solid light works point to your continual effort to merge the phenomenological, that ever elusive move toward an intended object, with the often dirty politics of media. I want to end by saying that the audience participants in the solid light works also become circulation figures, not just looking back in astonishment and wonder at the projector's origins, as in line describing a cone, but producers of their own surveillance, sullying the purity of light, the promise of an oceanic experience with their own cameras, their smartphones flashing, beaming back, interrupting, and inventing new inversions of cinematic as well as sculptural positions. Not able to even allow, sometimes, the vibrational tones generated by the musicians to wash over them for very long. They emit their own moans and gossip-laden narratives, intentions and reactions. The relational noise of so many figures circulate in and out of digital remediated information. Next speaker is Johanna Gosse.
Testing. So that's a tough act to follow, Melissa. What I've prepared is much more informal and probably more brief, and mostly stemming from my experience of seeing the show today. Having arrived just last night and having an opportunity to spend some time there today. And when I arrived at the show, a school group had just recently departed the galleries, and I started talking to the organizer of education programs here, and just was asking some questions about how these school groups tend to engage with Anthony's work. And I was interested to hear just how fearless and completely unintimidated these children are when they encounter Anthony's exhibition. They run directly through the different light projections without hesitation, and they are completely uninhibited in their engagement with his work. And so I think the difference between how these children are engaging with Anthony's work is more of a difference of degree than of kind in the way that adults engage with his work. I, of course, walked in with some hesitation about the darkness, and I think gradually was able to give over into the intense feelings of pleasure, really, that these works generate. So that pleasure which I think is both visual and haptic in nature, also, though, at the same time, arises some feelings of ambivalence. I think maybe not shared by everybody. It's a bit of my buzzkill moment that any sort of pleasure that I encounter, I'm also concerned about, is raising some anxieties about just sort of what kind of experience I'm meant to have. So I think what this experience I had today was raising for me was sort of the politics of that pleasure, and then also the politics of the sorts of participation that Anthony's work solicits and invites. And I think the paradox, the central paradox of Anthony's work, the idea of solid light works, solid light being a paradoxical category, brings us to the idea of the sublime in relation to how people encounter the light works. Words like magic and alchemy often are used to describe how the viewer experiences and encounters these works. And I think this, for me, I started to think about that paradoxical experience of beauty and vulnerability that we feel when we enter this space. And of course, this anxiety that attends the experience of the work in terms of the immersion into the darkness. And this experiential paradox, I think, when it gets framed in terms of the sublime, it relates to this monumentality, especially in the vertical works, and their framing in this enormous space. And of course, also these more recent works with their maritime references in the titles, and also the interpersonal references, so between you and I. And these maritime references bring me to think about the sea and the immersion of sort of the ocean, the oceanic landscape. And of course, these metaphors relating to sailing also connect to Anthony generating the ideas for these works during a sea voyage, his voyage from London to New York, as the initial source of this idea. And of course, sublime aesthetics are anchored in sort of a romantic sensibility. We think about them in relation to landscape, and if in terms of the sea, we think about them in relation to sort of a turbulent seascape. So I think the sublime is not quite the right aesthetic category to apply to these works. It's perhaps too turbulent and too violent to describe this much more, I would say, sort of calm, the sense of calm. And Anthony has described these areas that the light outlines as islands of calm, which I think relates again to this sort of oceanic metaphor. So what does this conversation about the sublime or about aesthetic experience have to do with politics? I think this category of the sublime is perhaps too intense and too overburdening of these works. And so while it does push us to encounter and confront our own limitations, as Anthony has stated, they are ultimately anchored in the geometric proportions of the human body. He's referenced the Vitruvian Man. The monumentality that they achieve is still, I think, cross-referenced with our bodies and maintains a sense of scale that is not fully sublime. So what does this have to do with politics? I think by making us think through the degree to which we feel a sense of agency when we're in encountering his work, and the control that we feel in the space, which is why I started by talking about children, and also the types of sociality that it opens up, which is obviously quite different to that sociality that they were first, when they were first staged in the 1970s. But I think these questions of the politics of participation and of pleasure are, of course, not new questions. They're questions that are very much rooted in the 70s. So, again, this, to me, I'm thinking today after this encounter at the exhibition about the status of participation in the 1970s versus today, the politics of participation after what we call the social turn in contemporary art, and what does it mean to talk about participatory art at a time when cultural participation is not so much an oppositional or a critical, it doesn't have so much of that critical function, but is actually something that is demanded of us in all areas of life. So those are just sort of some general provocations that I hope can frame discussion, not a encyclopedic overview of Anthony's body of work, but thinking about the present moment, and I hope opening on to Ed's remarks. So thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for those amazing remarks. I also want to bring up something political. I was going to talk about the relationship of Anthony's work to the Trump administration and the Me Too movement. I'm just kidding. Mine is totally apolitical and not about that at all. I want to thank Branden, Anthony, and Pioneer Works especially for convening this event. It's a really amazing occasion to discuss some really stunning and profound works. I'd also like to congratulate Anthony and Pioneer for staging them in such an incredible fashion. With Light Industry, Anthony has worked with myself and Thomas to stage several screenings of his work, and what we learned in the process of doing that from Anthony is that what seems very minimal does not mean it's easy. In fact, as Anthony kind of already discussed, the very minimal nature of these works actually means that every element has to be exactly right, and because its significance becomes magnified. When you walk into the room, there's only so much to see, and so that has to be exactly right. Now, last year I had the great pleasure of writing an essay on Anthony's work for an exhibition in Ireland at Lismore Castle Arts. For me, it was not only an occasion to discuss the work of one of my favorite filmmakers and artists, but as part of this, to delve into a question that has kind of bugged me about art in general for some time. And this is a very, very specific question, but I think Anthony's work actually addresses this directly. And that is, we often speak about artworks or about films or about musical works, etc., as being conceptual or idea-driven or even philosophical. But when can we say that an artwork actually does philosophical work? And that is, what I mean is not simply that it has the theme, philosophical themes contained within it, or that but can we truly say that a given artwork or a set of artists' works have the ability to prompt in us the kinds of ideas and realizations that, say, reading a philosophical essay by Wittgenstein or Plato or de Beauvoir can do? I'm not sure I answered this question, but I think asking this question and looking at the work actually raised some interesting things about it. So more specifically, can artworks do this philosophical work, prompt these philosophical ideas by formal or abstract means only? Because it's easy to see how a philosophical work could be achieved by language-driven essay films. You know, like if you see a film by Jean-Luc Godard or Chris Marker or Martha Rosler or indeed Anthony's own film Argument, you know, we can understand how a film with dialogue and could do that work, but it's more intriguing to wonder if films, this can happen at the level of form rather than the level of narrative or dialogue. So in my brief essay, I propose that Anthony McCall's solid light works indeed are able to do this, and that their ability to do so grows out of a series of experiments, and I do mean experiments in an almost scientific way, that McCall performed in the 1970s that lead into this body of work, experiments that were in part responding to discussions in the air at the time around avant-garde film and around the nature of film form. So as many of you know, at the end of the 60s, American film historian P. Adam Sitney proposed the term structural film for a certain tendency found in the minimalist movies of North American artists like Michael Snow or George Landau, wherein content of the film becomes secondary to the overarching form that unfolds over time. The famous quote by Sitney about this is, "Theirs is a cinema of structure in which the shape of the whole film is predetermined and simplified, and it is that shape that is the primal impression of the film." So if you've seen a film like Wavelength, this description is very apt. Now, during the next decade, in the 70s, Anthony created the first of what he would come to call the solid light works, the works that lead into the work that you see in this exhibition today. He dispensed entirely with representation to create a film called Line Describing a Cone, which is a 30-minute 16mm film that achieves basically much the same kinds of effects that the works here today do, but using the technology of its time. Sitney's oft-quoted description, in a sense, I would say is strikingly literalized here. McCall himself said, said, these works contain no illusion. It is a primary experience, not a secondary. The space is real, not referential. The time is real, not referential. So here we have works that, or let's think about films. Films usually are presenting, a photographic image. They are always going to be presenting the past to us. When you see, when you go to see Black Panther, you are actually watching the work of a studio that happened a year or 6 months ago. And so in a sense, you're always watching the past. But with Anthony's solid light films, you are only watching the present. There is no representation of something else that has happened in the past. Now, while Sydney in structural film is often metaphorically called sculptural, meaning like a film like Wavelength has a sculptural sensibility over time, due to the foregrounding of a film's rhythms and patterns, McCall's solid light films create actual three-dimensional objects in space, but objects with the evanescence and immateriality of cinematic images. Paradoxes, these are paradoxical objects, as we use this term a lot today already, that we want to touch when we see them, but yet we realize are not objects, but something more like events. Now, this line of investigation culminates in, he would do several solid light films in the 1970s, and in some ways, the ideas here culminate in a piece called Long Film for Ambient Light from 1975. This is a film, what Anthony calls a film, that consists of a preparation of a large room with a paper window covering, with paper covering the windows, the installation of a single naked light bulb hanging in the center of the room, and the placement of a time schema and an artist statement on the walls. One of these things on the walls is a statement called Notes and Duration. Long film for ambient light takes place over 24 hours, so it does exist in time, from midday to midday, and the ambient illumination in the chamber over that time slowly shifts from a mix of artificial light and natural light to that of artificial light alone in the middle of the night. McCall writes in the statement about long film, this film sits deliberately on a threshold between being considered a work of movement and being considered a static condition. Art that does not show change within our time span of attending to it, we tend to regard as object. Art that does not show change within our time span of attending to it, art that does show change within our time span of attending to it, we tend to regard as event. Art that outlives us, we tend to regard as eternal. What is at issue is that we ourselves are the division that cuts across what is essentially a sliding scale of time bases. A piece of paper on the wall is as much a duration as the projection of a film. Its only difference is in its immediate relationship to our perceptions. That is part of McCall's statement. Now, this passage from Notes and Duration approaches an intrinsic quality of McCall's work, and I think that, in fact, in this statement, McCall is only making explicit ideas that the works themselves implicitly invite the viewer to think about. So by inviting viewers to encounter these enigmatically constructed event objects, these solid light films being some of the most powerful instances of this, McCall forces spectators, viewers to back upon themselves to wonder about these things, all but requiring us to investigate the nature of our own perception. We are then pushed to consider the paradoxes at play in aspects of our existence as fundamental as space, time, and light. Engaging in extreme acts of material and temporal reduction, McCall discovered, through the discovery of the solid light form, a way to push a formal aesthetics into the realm of philosophical inquiry. Thus, if you approach these works with the same level of engagement and thinking that you would an essay, I believe that they will reward such inquiry by presenting us with this apparent event-object paradox. Thank you.
What I would like, I'm going to just check the time here, which is more than fine. What I would like to do, if I may, is actually just start us out by posing some broad questions which are really, in a way, feeding back the panel to itself. But I have some questions that have been, you see me furiously writing, inspired by everybody's presentation. But what I'd like to do is, rather than pose to each person individually who may have inspired them, but actually to ask everyone maybe everyone who would like to sort of say something about these broader questions that, at least to my mind, people's presentations have brought up, and hopefully we'll open on to some other questions. And the first one maybe comes up from Anthony's comment, not his beginning of his comment, but a little bit later, about the relationship to human scale. And I'd like to actually ask, the other panelists to maybe respond to this first, because one of the things that I found in the recent works, the last 10 years or so of works, is that the relationship to not just human scale, but to human body becomes, on the one hand, more prevalent. Right? So the titles refer to the corporeal. We get sinuous curves, for instance. And Anthony, I believe, has spoken about some of the lesser known early works in the 70s, the cone films that sort of breathe in and out as maybe being one of the places where this began in the 70s. But there's the titles, there's the verticality, which I think is also anthropomorphic in some sense, although not necessarily. But also at the same time, the relationship becomes more complicated because Anthony has put a series of intersecting lines, right? So rather than just a solid body, like line describing a cone that one can see, and also the series of what I call in the book externalized cuts, these sort of wipes or fades that move often from one shape to another, that sort of cut across. And if we're thinking of a projected work as a type of virtual body, this makes it very complicated because one body sort of fades out as another body sort of fades in. But that's just my sort of reaction in some ways to these works. And I just wonder about the relationship both in maybe how a sculpture might stand as a body, but then also how those sculptures interact with our bodies in the type of works that we can see in the other room, and maybe how they've changed from the earlier works that many of us have seen, like line describing a cone. We'd maybe start over here, and then if Anthony has something.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that quickly. Actually, by just restating something Anthony said to me once that made me think about that, and that is that, in sculpture, one of the fundamental ways we think about sculpture, of course, is in its relationship to human scale. We approach a sculpture and we compare it to our body. And Anthony, I believe, said to me once that one of the interesting things about getting bigger and bigger with sculpture, especially these things, is that at a certain point, if you go beyond a certain point, it stops being sculpture and it starts being experienced as architecture. And I think that part of the grounding of the solid light works in the human scale is in order to keep them from becoming entire chapels or cathedrals rather than separate works unto themselves. That said, I think it actually goes back to my point about Anthony, is that in doing that, he's in a sense implicitly testing our kind of conceptual frameworks that we bring to an event, and he's saying, I'm going to push this in some cases right to the edge of that category.
Right, I think, yeah, exactly, this idea of pushing right up into a threshold and creating threshold experiences that don't tip over into this full monumentality or that sort of sacral space of the cathedral. I wanted to draw it also because of the opportunity we have in this exhibition to experience vertical and horizontal works. I think there is a distinction between these two in terms of how we engage them, and this is also cribbing from something Anthony has said about the vertical works as becoming spaces to inhabit, the idea of these islands, and that we transgress the beam and then we enter these spaces and they are enclosing us, versus the horizontal works, which function more like beams that we are invited to interrupt. So this idea of inhabitation versus interruption And I see the inhabitation as a more sculptural and maybe spatial relationship versus the interruption as a more cinematic and temporal one. But that again, I think to become too binary or too dualistic is not a good idea. But those are just ways I've been thinking about them, and is reinforced by, again, these kids that this morning immediately ran right up to the horizontal beam and disrupted it, tried to short circuit it as soon as they got into the gallery, versus the vertical works immediately sat inside of them. So that sort of more immediate encounter with the works and sort of getting right down to that fundamental tension between them. But
I want to say something quickly because I want to hear Anthony respond, but what I find, there's a disparity between the photographic representation of the works that have been reproduced throughout history and even now, and I asked Pioneer Works to try to give me an image of crazy cell phones all over, because most of the images, and I love Pioneer Works, so this is no comment about that, and they gave me so much, but the images are gorgeous. They're highly aestheticized that they took. They're beautiful, but they're almost void of that mediated experience that I was talking about of bodies coming into them with technology. So I feel like there's many levels to this. The other one is, like Branden said, the titles imply almost a romantic relationship between some of the cones, right? So embodying them and personalizing them as relationships, which when they're void of people, it's a very romantic framework. But what I love is when people come into them, there's a kind of violence in the way they cut into it, they cut into each other. I remember Spencer telling me it was really hard to find a space where he could just chill and listen after when he went to one of the performances he wasn't playing in. I felt the same way. People were in my face. Like, I like the kind of, at first I hated it, and then I'm like, this is so awesome. It's like one of the most successful relational sculptures that have interacted with. So that kind of violence cuts through that beautiful, light cake of romantic relations. I don't know what you think about that.
Wow, thank you. I really just wanted to, your question was really about scale in the body, wasn't it?
Or just any relationship to the body at all.
Yeah, because I mean,
how it might have changed.
As you know from my titles, what I had in mind was that there was always some dialogue. You can't really represent a body, you can only represent bodies when they're in relation to another body. So I always felt that I was working always with two forms in these sculptural pieces. And that what I actually was searching for was the sculptural equivalent of parallel action. In parallel action in cinema, you have the means to cut back and forth between, if you like, two figures. They could be talking, two actions. I was interested in this idea of representing a state of exchange, and which in my mind were corporeal exchanges. But parallel action was what I had in mind when I developed the idea of the wipe, which is a cinematic, archaic cinematic form which, instead of cutting from one image to another, you would, one image would slowly cover the other one up. So for instance, you would, in a 40s noir film, you have a shot of a man driving. You can see his face, the windscreen wipers, it's always raining, he's smoking, of course, all that sort of thing. And then you have a wipe, which very slowly this new image, moving image, comes in and covers it up. And the new image is woman at bar drinking heavily. Right, sound familiar? So my contribution to this was I stole the idea of the wipe. But instead of it lasting half a second, I made this wipe last 7.5 minutes, say, or 15 minutes, so that the wipe became everything. And it was able to modify, to bring together and to separate whatever the linear forms were that I was working with. One may have been an ellipse, which let's say was opening and closing. The other may have been a wave traveling through across space. Point is that each of these forms have their own independent life, and then the wipe, which separates or joins them, has its independent life. And so with some very few simple linear forms, you get quite considerable complexity.
Can I quickly say one quick thing about the wipe? Because David Grubbs and I were talking about the way he composed some of the sound to some of your works, and one way was to transpose the wipe as a sine wave. And I thought that was fabulous, and maybe later we can talk about that relationship between both your drawings, the movement in the work, and the way it's been transposed into sound and music.
One of the things that I like about the wipe, and I'll ask another question though, is that so not only does it reduplicate the relationship or complexify the relationship to cinema, right? Because we now have this other cinematic device happening, but it also reduplicates and complexifies relationship to sculpture, because in some of the works, when you're standing inside and it's sweeping across, even though it's not itself a solid form, it's an interruption between two solid forms. What I remember, in seeing some of the exhibitions is people try to stay on it's the side of the wipe, So it has a force, it has a sort of spatial force that's equivalent to, so you redouble and you have now solid light and then something that's not solid light that's also acting in a sculptural manner, so that whole level of complexity sort of comes in again. And that leads me to the sort of second question, which is a bit inspired from Melissa's talk, which is a question about how about the recursive nature of some of the work that you've done, right? So solid light films, and I want to ask everyone about this, but maybe this is a question that Anthony answers first. I don't know. It can be whatever. But there are so many works that. Already the whole notion of the solid light film is one, as you said, it had two periods. There was a period in the 70s and there's a period that started around 2000, is it 4 or 6 or something? I can't remember. I know it's an even year because it was a Whitney biennial year, but yeah. So, so those come back, but also there's other recursive relationships. So circulation figures, for instance, which was a sort of performance happening, gets a new life as something that we look at as an installation. Sound that you were working on in the 70s comes back in a different way. You were thinking about sound as a continuous presence at that time, and so now we have sound as a continuous presence through the collaborations you've done with David and others, so here but also in other sorts of things. And so there's sort of two questions, and so one is a producer question and one is a recipient question, and one is maybe how you think about the recursive nature of looking back and going forward. And whether how you felt that as a resource or limitation or whatever, but also it's a historical question, right? Because from the time of that Whitney biennial and so when that Whitney biennial, you had a new work, but also Line Describing a Cone was shown as an installation. It has a new life, but also then we learn more about different works, different dimensions come forward, and that keeps happening, right? So there's a series of beautiful publications. The one that was done on your drawings recently, or that Anne Wagner wrote for, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of us as people who write about films and works and things are also looking at this sort of increasing complexity. And I think that, Ed read a little bit of a statement about Line Describing a Cone from the 70s, and all of us have read the great writing about Anthony in the 70s by P. Adam Sidney and others, and it was very directed and very specific to Line Describing a Cone or to one sort of thing. And now the complexity of the career from the 60s to the 70s and the complexity of the career now in the works, we're seeing solid light films, but there have been installations, there have been a series of drawings, there are photographs, all these different things that we know. And so just something about this sort of looking back, looking forward, a little bit inspired by what Melissa was doing by looking back to look forward to ask questions here, but But I wonder about that question, about the sort of increasing complexity of production and reception.
Well, you know, the early work for me is more and more mysterious, and for that reason, very productive for me to try and go and scratch my head over, you know, and sometimes earlier work that was just sitting there seems to become freshly relevant. So, for instance, I became very interested in using sound in one of the solid light films, and with David Grubb's help, we developed a soundtrack for that. And that act of making a piece that needed sound, I should, I suppose, explain which the piece was. It was called Leaving with 2-Minute Silence. And it was essential for the aesthetics of the piece that there was, in the center of the work, there was a 2-minute silence. And but in order to make a 2-minute silence, you first have to have sound to remove in order to create the silence. So the question became this sort of negative question, well, what should the sound be? Well, I don't care, because what I need is the silence. But in the end, you know, I picked something very ordinary, like traffic noise outside the window and the noise of an urban harbor. And those became my sounds. Anyway, the piece was completed, and I was satisfied with it. But then it raised the question of, well, so why the sound? Where's that come from? And I remembered at that point that in 1972 I'd made a sound installation, which was made of white noise, which was basically the idea of using white noise as a sculptural medium to animate a space, and it would the white noise would be structured to have a roar going through space, crashing down at the far end over and over again. And I thought, well, I really must dig that out and listen to it, because I have no idea what I had in mind at the time. And I went back to look for my to the drawer marked 1972 and found that it was empty. And that somehow this 1-inch Ampex magnetic tape reel had been lost. But I did discover that I'd kept my studio notes from when I'd made it in an electronic music lab in Cardiff University. And I'd got a drawing, which actually Melissa showed, a white noise drawing with the little dots. I had enough to go on. So I went and found a friend who was a sound engineer and asked him if he would help me put it together. And we remade the piece. And we installed it, I think, the first time at Yale University Art Gallery, College Art Gallery. Found that it was actually suddenly felt very fresh to me and very interesting. And in a way, it became the basis then for thinking about some new pieces. That's just one example.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry, is it okay? Really quick. Do you feel that, well, one way you've approached sound, if I can say this, is representationally. I have to say, like, and I remember reading you also being frustrated about, at one point, in that particular piece, Leaving with 2-Minute Silence, how it actually sounded like a real wave.
Oh yeah, well,
right?
There's a long. No, that was a different conversation. But yes, I did say somewhere that the frustrating thing about the white noise piece when I remade it was that whatever I did, it wanted to be the sound of an ocean wave, and I couldn't understand why I hadn't noticed this in 1972. But I went back to my notebook. And found a grudging reference in very small type at the bottom saying, sounds like a wave. Which I had completely ignored and certainly forgotten.
Yeah.
And this time, it's unmistakable. It's an ocean wave crashing through the space repeatedly. Yeah.
Right, and what's interesting to me about, so that's just one level of it, but I love, it reminds me of Paul Schertz and the way he thought about the relationship of vision and sound. And I feel like you have a relationship to that, where you see this analogous, you want seeing or vision to be spatialized in a similar way that sound spatializes. You do achieve that, I feel, sometimes. Like in these solid light works, in the way people were playing with them. And then there was another quote you said that someone else said, like a viewer, that said, ooh, I almost felt like the ray that was coming out of his work was being actually produced by the sound itself, right? And I love that, and I felt like that when Carbon was playing. I have this video that I didn't, because I only had a time limit, where I'm laying on my back, and it's just amazing, the accompaniment to both the rays, the vertical rays, and then the fog. It starts, and what's weird is it starts to create a romantic narrative for me. Just that's me doing it. But I love how the visual interacts with sound, and I loved how it did that with the composers that David and you chose to do this with. So I wondered, is your relationship similar to Paul Sherritt's in that you were striving and have been striving to make those two talk to each other or be influenced?
I can't comment on whether it's like Paul Sherritt's, but I wouldn't certainly dare. But yes, I've certainly, it's an interesting problem. I mean, first of all, sound, by sound I mean noise as opposed to music or voice. But the noise category of sound is very narrative. It's far more narrative than images are. I mean, it's very hard to have abstract sound. And so that difficulty interests me a lot. And I remember I had a conversation with Jeff Price, the filmmaker who's here, in this very space. We were talking about sound in relation to these pieces. And Jeff's comment, which was very smart, was that he's a filmmaker, and he said, you know, you can put any sound with any image when you make a film, but these forms seem to not particularly want a sound added. It would be an addition. And I think that identifies a difficulty. Of course, difficulties are interesting, but it's one that I'm certainly struggling with.
I just wanted to mention with this idea of redoubling and going back, and you know, I think that this is also kind of an intrinsic nature of the solid light pieces, especially. Many of you might know that the first solid light film, Line Describing a Cone, you can still rent from various film distributors as a 16mm print and mount, but of course, showing this work is vastly different from, let's say, renting a print of Vivre sa vie and showing it. It's actually, the film print is only one component of the work in a sense. You have to have the film print and you have to execute the directions according to Anthony's a kind of sheet that comes with it. You need to find a room of a certain size. You need to have a kind of particles of dust or some sort of smoke in the room. And so because of that, every time it's staged, it's only in the present, and because it's only ever in the present, the history of staging the work, there's always some sort of snapshot of that moment, like the change in like how people smoke indoors or not, or how, you know, I've actually mounted this at Bard College, you know, almost about once every 2 years with students, and I make them just do it as a project, a curatorial project, just like, here's the instructions, make it happen. One of the hardest things they had to find was because all the buildings at Bard have smoke detectors, and so we couldn't even, and they were like laser-based smoke detectors that like shoot out, and if any vapor in the room, they just go off. So we had to like scour the campus to find a place that had no smoke detectors, and luckily the student music venue has no smoke detectors, which is perhaps a little white snaky. I don't know if how safe that is, but in any case, so we've done it there, and so each time is kind of a snapshot. And one thing I noticed when we did, in 2010, we did a cycle of the solid light films, is we did them after the fact, after 2004, when Anthony's been making these digital solid light films that of course are silent. They don't have you don't see the projector in exactly the same way. The projector is in the room when you do it on 16. And suddenly for the first time when I watched these films, I realized I've always thought of the circle on the wall as kind of incidental. It's just the edge of the cone, right? It's not a thing unto itself. But watching them in the age of digital media, I was hyper aware of this as a clock. that the time was running out, the 30 minutes are down, and that there was a kind of synchrony between the image of the circle and the reels of film themselves, like the film kind of going from one reel to the take-up reel. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm not sure would have been as visible. And I think that's just one note of how these works, because they are events that happen only in the present, are always renewing themselves when they're exhibited.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because in hearing Anthony's response to my question, I realized that the answer was already in what you had said, which is the event object, right? Because Anthony's work, to an extent, I don't want to say unique, but in some way, Anthony's works are experiential, so you can know about them, right? And then, but as an art historian, as a historian, you don't really have access to it until it's been mounted as an event that you then get to, in a sense, experience. Like, we know a certain thing about circulation figures, but until we see it, it's not circulation figures. This, of course, is true of any film and of any artwork, right? But I think that the event character, what you're calling the present character of it, is so heightened, in a sense, that we know about it, then when we experience it, we know about it in a very different way, to, I would say, a difference in, not just in degree, but in kind, from the distinction between, say, seeing a painting in reproduction and seeing that painting. Yeah, definitely, when you see paintings, you see a lot more if you study them in a certain sense, but there's something very event-oriented about Anthony's work, so you have to take advantage of these types of possibilities of somebody actually mounting them and doing them. I'm going to just check the time one more time. Is that a text from me, from the organizers? Yeah, it is, actually. That's interesting, because that's really bad training, because that means that I can just check my email and it'll look like I'm doing work. We will turn it over to questions, although I reserve the right to ask another of my questions, should I have a moment. But we're a little blinded here, because we have an installation that's not by Anthony called Lights in Your Eyes. But I will be able to see if people have questions, and if they do, then there's one way over there. Then the microphone should make their way to those people. So.
Anthony, you spoke about Leonardo da Vinci, and I've been exploring Leonardo da Vinci as a puzzler. Are you following me? Leonardo da Vinci as a puzzler. And in looking at your work and hearing people talk about it, it looks like that is what you've been doing over the years, trying to puzzle, put things together. How much of an influence was Leonardo in your thinking?
Well, no more than any other schoolboy, really. Actually, it's probably the only drawing I really know. Just kidding, but no, not a great, nothing. No.
Thank you.
But one thing that you did think a lot about is draftsmanship, yeah, and drawing. So, I mean, that's something that I think really could come out of that. I mean, that you are an incredibly precise and beautiful draftsman, and a lot of these works exist as drawings, not just the outlines, but full-on drawings in that sense. So you do have a relationship between sculpture and drawing that's very sculptural, in a sense, that whether you know about or thinking about Leonardo or not, you are going through some of those motions. It seems, in a sense, to me.
No, I think that's perfectly true. I mean, yeah, maybe yeah.
Do we have another?
A question for...
Oh, okay.
I have the mic. Okay. I saw a line describing a cone back in the 70s, I guess, when you were touring it around colleges. Line describing a cone, and it was really transformative. I mean, it was probably the first piece of immersive cinema I ever experienced, and I don't think I've ever experienced a more complete one. But so my simplified question would be, do you think light itself has changed very much since the 70s?
Great question. I think it's unanswerable, really.
What about the fact that you can actually have a flashlight in the gallery with your phone, that you can be illuminating the installation with your selfie?
That's a very helpful comment, thank you.
Well, but also...
No, it is, because actually, one of the things that I've noticed about this showing of my work is the degree to which the smartphone has become part of the whole experience. I mean, I've been quite surprised at how many people advance toward what I thought of as a sculptural object, changing over time, therefore a cinematic one too, approaching it as a way, as a source of a photograph. And the other distinctive thing about that is if there are 15 people photographing the same work at the same time, which remarkably has not been so unusual, you have 15 screens, each of which is brighter than the object that's being photographed. And I think that's quite a profound shift, actually. I haven't figured out what I think about it, but it does actually bring to mind circulation figures, which Melissa was showing earlier, which at the time seemed like some dystopian impossibility, that something as perverse as a bunch of photographers gathering together in a room to photograph one another could possibly take place. And now it seems, a description of everyday life. So it's not exactly like, but I think closely related.
I also think it's funny that when people jump in with their cell phones or to take photos, it is unphotographable. But yet, people just cannot help themselves. And then I'm sure they go back and look at their photos and like, oh, it doesn't look anything like that. Or it freezes them in a moment and it makes it something very different. Yeah.
Well, and then there was the night that we were not allowed to bring our cell phones in. Or no, we could, but Pioneer Works kept saying, you can't, the security guards were like, you can't use those. And I was like, whoa. And that was when Carbon and Spencer and Chichen and the fourth one was, anyhow. And it was very different, I heard, than the first night with David Grubbs and company, when I heard some people saying, oh my God, it was impossible, I couldn't focus, it was really challenging, and maybe that was a response to that, but it actually changes the work, because I then could see the work better, because there wasn't as much light, right? And I could hear the sound much better. But it was almost like an entirely different work from one night to the next. It was kind of astounding,
Just in terms of time change, when I first saw it, it was cigarette smoke. It was cigarette smoke. And now, when I've shown it in my classes and we just get smoke machines. But it's a smoke machine now, but I'm smelling it while we're sitting in the audience. And I just feel like, I feel like there's this edge of the heroic, when we're talking about changes over time, but there's also this level of pollution.
Of what?
Of pollution.
Yeah.
And almost it's through pollution we're able to see. And I just think that's I actually thought that's what you were going to speak about, your ambiguity. So I just think, when we're talking that it doesn't have politics because it's minimalist and form, but there's something that I'm feeling in my body right now. I don't know if other people, I'm feeling that smoke. And originally it was cigarettes, which we didn't even recognize, we didn't feel. So I just think maybe it's interesting that it's in that negative space, through the negativity of smoke, we see light. So that split is interesting.
And is it correct that you couldn't, I at least read that without these haze machines as they exist now, you couldn't really stage these works in quite the same way? And the same with digital projectors being so much lighter than analog projectors. The vertical works are also made possible by these new
the vertical
technologies.
works are made possible by digital projectors. I'd drawn, in 1970s notebooks, I'd certainly drawn a vertical work, but it was totally impossible. You can't turn a a 16mm projector through 90 degrees and expect the reels to stay on. And it just wouldn't have worked. So that was certainly a possibility that was made possible because of the shift. But another big shift, apart from cigarette smoke and 16mm and dust and in the air and so on, was that the audiences for the work in the 1970s were by and large other artists and filmmakers. They were very small audiences. You would be happy if you had 15 or 20 people there. And it would be for one night. That was your lot for the year, you know. So there were some profound differences between the milieu of that time and the present, where art now has become something that's widely agreed to be popular. You know, people like it. It's something people do with their lives.
Hey,
that's a big shift also.
can I also ask a quick question about the pixel versus the scratch? Because Ed brings that up, actually, don't you? In one of your in your writing?
Yes, not
Could
the part I read.
you restate that, though, how you think about it? And I want to hear what Anthony thinks about it.
Sounds like a good title for a book.
The pixel versus the scratch.
I don't recall what I said, actually.
You said that they were parallel, that you thought that the digital pixel was like the new scratch.
Well, this came up because Anthony showed me some of the earliest digital works, which of course now earliest is, you know, only 10, 13 years ago, but at that time you weren't working in HD. So some of the earlier digital works have, you know, you can see the pixels on the edge of the image in a way that the new HD ones you can't. And my only comment was that, you know, and you had actually talked about, like, you had a moment of thinking, should I remaster these and make them HD, or should I keep the pixel? And keeping the pixel to me was a kind of gesture towards when they were made and their time, in the same way that a scratch on a film is a gesture towards that time.
Sure,
Yeah.
and they have completely different effects. The scratch on the film you experience as shooting stars in space, because they only last a frame, and it's as if they're flying past you. The pixels, which is the sawtooth edge of a curved line, you actually have a very beautiful artifact of that digitally, which is you have striations running through space from the outer edge of the curve to the projector. So, right, really fine converging lines.
So you find those a beautiful part of the work, right?
I accept all those things, mostly, yeah.
Yeah. Because of the precision, I know some viewers are like, the pixels are there, you know? So
line describing a cone by today's digital standards looks extremely handmade. Yeah. And in fact, it was, you know, my first animation, so it was quite badly made. And it was done in two halves, and there's a point in the film where the two halves don't quite meet. Yeah. And I remember a desperate call from Australia some years ago from someone who'd rented the film, and it'd come from Lux in London. And they were about to show it, and to their horror, they realized that a terrible mistake had happened to the print. And they wondered if I could get a new print out of them. And I said, what was the mistake? And they said, the lines don't meet. I said, oh, that's just bad animation. That's the authentic. And he said, it's the authentic version? Oh, yeah, absolutely fine. And he was quite happy after that.
One thing this brings to mind is that, you know, when I've staged this with students, they've often taken the opportunity to do it with cigarette smoke. So they're like, oh, great, an opportunity to smoke, so we're all going to smoke. And you can't get even with Bard students, you can't get enough cigarette smoke in the room to equal the level of smoke that a smoke machine has. And so the texture of the material, so to speak, is very, very different. You know, it's much thinner with cigarette smoke, and with the smoke machines, it becomes almost like marble, and you can see these kind of swirling marble details in it. And that's a big difference in the way in which you stage it as well.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I'm curious what you think about the difference in differentiation between light reflecting on flat paintings and sculptures.
You know, I don't think I'm qualified to comment on that. Nothing comes to mind. I'm terribly sorry. Anyone else? I guess not.
I'm afraid of that question.
We have hands up, but I have no idea where the microphone is. I'd love it to go here, if that's possible. To your left.
Thanks. So I wanted to go back to something that Anthony said at the very beginning.
Speak up just a little bit.
Sorry.
Even with the mic.
At the beginning, Anthony, you were talking about this space or sort of a situation between sculpture and cinema, between the still and the moving image, so between kind of stasis and movement. And it seems that what you said, but just to kind of rephrase it, in my own words, that what lies between these two things is slowness, a temporality of slowness, of barely perceptible motion. So I just was wondering, because I don't recall having read it in your writings, although I may have missed it, whether you had any precedents for your thinking about slowness as, or this kind of liminal perception of movement as a formal aesthetic gambit. Of course, that's something that a number of artists in the 60s, in the 50s, starting with Alexander Calder, kinetic artists, some had worked with this sort of barely perceptible motion to imply something that wasn't quite sculpture.
Yeah, I mean, there are two, I suppose, it comes from two places. I mean, one was the one I was talking about earlier, which is that in order to preserve a kind of sculptural looking, it was necessary for it to seem as if it was motionless, at least to begin with, which I think has been quite successful, because it does shift and change, and that shifting and changing does become part of your perception of it as you look, but by then you're already looking at it as if it's sculpture. So that was one place, but there was an earlier place, I think, which doesn't have to do with slowness so much as how long something lasts, and therefore it needs to be slowed down so it lasts longer, which is my early fire performances. I found that people were coming. The audiences were small, but those that came were coming, some were coming with the perception that they were going to see something related to a firework display. Of course, they were disappointed, especially because my idea about the audience had been that they were witnesses to a rather slow sculptural process. So there was a little misunderstanding there, and I after doing a couple of these and realizing they had disappointed quite a few people, that had to actually evade this problem altogether, and I began to ask, how can I get out of it? And my solution was to say, this is very simple. The problem is that if something lasts half an hour or an hour, everyone is going to become assemble as an audience to watch it. That's what an audience is. And I thought that if you didn't have that audience constituted that way, you would remove the problem of the expectation. And so I realized that if I made a fire piece last not an hour, but all day, say from dawn to dusk, then you convert your audience, your assembled audience, into individual visitors. And of course that's what we now think of as the way you look at installations, or a long duration event is attended to in a completely different way. But that's the origin of the the slowness.
So it was much more. So it was much less about the formal characteristic of the work as being slowed, and more this desire to facilitate a certain kind of spectatorial relationship.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we have other questions. I would really like to answer that last one. But...
Hi. You've spoken a bit about this, but I was wondering if you could talk about how the advent of digital projection changed the way that you think about light in cinema.
Changes your experience of light.
Okay, thanks. As opposed to 16 millimeter, you mean? Well, I think one, actually the big difference for me is in the working methods. You know, I've always found that digital production is much closer to the hand, like when the hand drawing or something, than film. Film animation was a long, complicated, and slow process, and it wasn't until you'd made the film and sent it to the lab and processed it and made it a print and brought it back, put it on a projector, projecting it, that you discovered if you'd been wasting your time or not. Whereas with digital, is always an open possibility, and it's much closer to making a drawing where you make a mark and then you can erase it, make another mark, and keep building on it. So it's in that sense I see a big, significant difference. But, you know, at the end of the day, a solid light film made of 16 millimeter and one made of digital fundamentally is the same thing. It's a beam of light is being projected across space, and people are walking around it and looking at it.
So I believe we have time for one more question. Is that what? I can't see. You have to say it. Is that two? Two more questions. All right. So, and we're finding there's a hand here or someone else. I just wanted, if I could, maybe to respond actually to Andrew's question a little bit about, and what Anthony said about audience, because it flows into what would have been my other question that had been inspired both by Johanna and Ed, and that is that I think that the temporality and the medium relationship that's in Anthony's work, which is so interesting between cinema, sculpture, and drawing, or time, space, and concept or idea, because in some ways the drawing is the footprint when we finally see it, is this way that each of the mediums, he pushes to them, but then he exceeds them, right? So that it's sculpture, but yet it's not, and it moves over into that. And George Baker has written about this in terms of medium, but I think the other thing, and that what Anthony's comments about audience get to, is that audience is related to where the audience is assembled. So audience is related to institution, you know, and I'm not saying in a bad sense like institutions co-opt everything. I'm talking about the different institutions that each of these things come with. And I've always thought that one of the things that's so interesting to me about Anthony's work and the temporality and the medium relationship, and where I would differ from George, who would like to see it as medium, is that even as they sort of exceed them, they necessitate, even as they exceed, the institutional genealogies that they refer to. So you have to have a sort of historical memory of what cinema is to see how cinema is being exceeded. You have to have a historical memory of what sculpture is and where you see sculpture and how you see sculpture to see how it's being exceeded. And I think the same thing is true of, in some ways, a relationship to drawing. And so when Ed was talking about long film for ambient light, which is this film that has no film, which is in a room, you know, we're right in between the cinema, which is dissolving away, and the gallery, which is in some sense forming, you know. And even as Anthony questioning what is the temporality of a piece of paper tacked against the wall, right? Well, a piece of paper tacked against the wall is art, right? But no, it's not, right? It's transforming cinema. And so I think that the relationship to audience moves into these types of questions that Johanna and Ed were asking about audience, politics, spectatorship, and that's really where I think that the work is quite interesting and unfolds in that sense.
I think to add to that, I think the status of animation is something that recurs, you refer to them as animations, and the idea of durational animation and the sort of history of animation in avant-garde cinema, and our expectations for animation is something that is moving rapidly, and you're slowing down. I think you call it the sort of slowness of the disclosure, which adds to that idea of this philosophical encounter that we're able to have. But yeah, I'm very interested in animation's role in all of this as sort of drawing and moving drawings. But Ed, you were gonna...
I was just going to say very quickly to answer Ida's question about the shift from film to digital, is I actually think the bigger shift is not from film to digital, but from the 4:3 aspect ratio to the 16:9 aspect ratio of HD. Because, of course, we don't really see this in the works, but you're working in a canvas that is determined by the shape of the video. And when HD came in and we all shifted to 16:9, and you have a very high resolution image, it really allowed you to open up that canvas and explore different shapes and different kinds of sizes as well, because it's much more scalable. So I think that there is actually like a material shift that happens at that point.
I want to jump in and say another quick thing, because it inspired me to think of this, is that it seems that, because we're all talking about it as if it's a post-expanded field, right, kind of sculpture, the Rosalind Krauss argument. But indeed, by calling them solid light works, we're also brought back to the famous comment that what sculpture is it's what you back into when you look at painting, right? And so I feel like the tension of that kind of 3D object in a density is there with cinema. So there's an expansion, but there's also a reference to something before that expansion. And I think that tension is really what is also really seductive about the work.
Where is the microphone now? I feel I might have taken the one of the two questions, but yeah.
Hi. Oh, that's really loud. I actually wanted to sort of jump on when we were discussing smartphones and the experience sort of in 2018 versus when these were created in the 70s. You touched a little bit on how people viewed it in the 70s as more of like a small environment of artists. But I think I wanted to look less at the form of the art and more of the environment. And I think we all agree that the body is so important in these pieces. I see these being in, I saw the cone in 2017 at the Whitney Biennial. I see these now in 2018. These are all post-election. I think it's impossible to deny that the environment that we are living in is extremely grieving a space for belonging, for our bodies to exist without being judged, without being sort of looked on as like beings that are going to be part of a discussion of like the gender binary. And I just think that being in such a politically potent space, I know that you're speaking as someone who's from the UK, there are discussions of isolation going on there as well. I think it's just really interesting. These pieces also exist without a border. There is no perimeter around these pieces for people to, exist like without, like you have to enter these spaces. I also think it's really significant that you are in the dark. There is no sense of being judged. Like you can be a part of something without being looked at. I also think it's really important that the Pioneer Works is donation-based, so it's without sort of these class divisions. I just think I really wanted to ask you how you see your own work in this like really extremely, I think, difficult political space, even though it's, these works aren't necessarily supposed to be speaking politically, but they do offer that space that people are desiring.
It's a great question. But I think the only way I'm going to be able to address it is really just in what I do next. It's one's constantly dealing with new difficulties. And
what are you doing next?
Wondering, how relevant what one is doing is, and so on. And I think it's best addressed by practice, really. Well, I can't really give an answer other than saying, of course, I'm sympathetic to the question.
Can I just say something? I think that was a very beautifully worded question, and I think for me it makes me think about how abstraction is actually opening up this opportunity. And in an earlier interview context, somebody was asking about these maritime references, and you responded, well, yes, of course we can think about that in terms of the refugee situation. That's right. And I think the abstraction of this and of this, public scenario, we're coming in, we can be in space together, bodies in space, in the dark, unseen, but encountering one another, I think opens all of these references that you've brought in, and it's just I think it's a very beautiful way of talking about the kind of non-dualism, the open-endedness, and the unsurveilled nature of the space. Of course, when the smartphones come out, maybe not so much, but anyway, I just wanted to add that in because you yourself have talked about how the restagings can open up these political questions.
And can I say quickly what I find really interesting about how abstraction is being viewed now politically? Because Rachel Rakes has also done a whole series on the documentary Abstract. And I'm thinking about the history of structuralist film. When it first began, a lot of feminist people and filmmakers like Abigail Child, who's here tonight, and others actually really critiqued the lack of the presence of othered bodies in that recognition. And so that what happened is the kind of structuralism and those tools, you can maybe speak to this, then were used, included like this effluvia of bodies and sex and otherness, all these questions about race and So I feel like this atmosphere really opens your work up to those questions like you so beautifully articulated. And thank you for that. It's just right on.
And so I am actually being signaled that I took one of the two questions, but I think we're all agreed that that was a great question to end on. So join me in thanking our panelists one last time.